Good evening and good morning, depending on wherever you are. I, Purushinder Singh, on behalf of Kutch International, welcome you all to the fourth virtual workshop of the series Defense News Conclave, Stories of U.S. India Defense Partnership. The theme of today's workshop is India-U.S. geopolitical relations, past, present, and future. Before we dive into the informative and fruitful discussion, just setting out some house announcements. Today's session will be 1 hour and 30 minutes. The last 30 minutes will be dedicated for question and answer session. We encourage the members of the panel to keep their cameras on and the microphones off until unless they are speaking. This session is recorded and will be later on released on the Kutch YouTube channel. It is encouraged that the audience members post their questions indicating relevant speakers in the chat box directly to me with their names and description of their organization. Before further ado, with this, I hand over the rein of the workshop to our moderator, Mr. Dipanjan Chaudhury, Diplomatic Editor, Economic Times, who would introduce our panel and take this workshop forward. Now open to you, sir.
Yeah. Good evening, Puru. I'll call you Puru. I mean, I know you by the name Puru. Yeah. Good evening. Thank you for involving me in this workshop. I by no means is an expert on defense affairs. There are many more illustrious people who are in the panel with me. General Hooda, whose daughter was once my junior colleague in Economic Times. Anit, I have met him once in Singapore long back. I mean, it's been 7 years. And Mr. Vickery, I have heard him, read him, and Dr. Rao, who is a close, a colleague and also somebody, an expert. I look forward to her constant views on number of issues. Kutch has taken a very unique initiative in organizing this series of workshops, and I understand that this would also go offline in the months to come, which would bring people face to face and therefore enable a better kind of and a camaraderie and better understanding of certain issues. The topic is absolutely interesting, and coming from what I was listening to Dr. Jaishankar last night in U.S. while before he starts his bilateral engagements in D.C. and as he reached D.C. from New York, and he mentioned a couple of things about the Indo-U.S. defense relationship, and I thought pertinent to point to that because there is no other person better placed than him who has been part of this journey for the last so many decades. Even when he was as a young officer, when he was posted in the Indian Embassy in Washington, and later, he's handled the America desk from Delhi and was part of the nuclear deal. And he rightly described the nuclear deal as rather divided the Indo-US relations to the pre-nuclear deal era and the post-nuclear deal era, and mentioned and recalled that how before the defense relationship blossomed, that India had constantly tried to source weapons from the US from the 1960s, but 40 years there was no success. Still, almost the past 2 decades, and that and the situation was such, and General Hooda is quite familiar with that. And we were compelled, or rather, we went to the other partner who were willing to share, sell arms and share technology, and therefore, that led to a relationship between Delhi and Soviet Union, and later between Russia and India, which I hear, and of late, particularly in the last 6 months, there have been a lot of debate on this, that why is India has a close defense relationship with Moscow without some of the commentators, and these are new age commentators in US who I believe are not taking the holistic view of the relation, not taking the past into consideration as why that defense relationship developed, and why Indo-US defense relationship haven't really matured to the level of Indo-US economic relationship, Indo-US people-to-people ties, Indo-US trade relationship, Indo-US maritime partnership, which has blossomed in the last 20 years or so. And there cannot be a better panel than this. General Hooda, who's been at the forefront till few years in fighting the two adversaries based in Jammu and Kashmir. Um, uh, we would be followed after General Hooda by Anit and Mr. Vickery, and then we have Dr. Rao coming in. Dr. Rao would bring in a perspective of Europe into the Indo-US relationship and how some of the European countries are now trying to come into the Pacific as partners of India and U.S. relation. And I would like to, end my opening remarks by saying that the transfer of technology still remains a big obstacle in this defense relationship. And India is not a member of NATO, and probably India will not join NATO in its form. And despite having dialogue with NATO from time to time, uh, too big a country to become a member of a security alliance per se. We are into one of these security alliances. We will definitely be asked to be part of other security alliances. I'm talking about security alliances. And India would not like to be into A camp or B camp and rather navigate this very complex geopolitics. So how do we in this maximize the defense relationship, and how does US, come out of its, kind of hesitation? India is trying to come out of its hesitation. There is a way to go, and US also is trying to come out of its hesitation. And there has to be a way forward rather than putting sanctions on India. Instead, how to work in sharing technology and convincing the Senate on the importance of India as the world's most thriving democracy and a country whose strong defense would ensure peace and stability, would ensure a deterrence factor is maintained in the Indo-Pacific region. I now welcome General Hooda, who needs no further introduction with much ado to deliver his opening remarks. We will again go back to second round as decided by the flow of events by Cuts International.
So thank you very much, Dipanjan. And I'll take my 2 rounds as follows. In the first round, I'm going to talk about some strategic realignments, recent geopolitical events, with a view to giving us some glimpses of the challenges and the opportunities in the India-U.S. bilateral relations. And I'll take the second round in, looking ahead, say maybe a decade or so. I think 25 years is too far to look into the future. Maybe over the next decade, and give some pointers on how I think, India-U.S. relations can be strengthened and taken forward. Before I begin, let me just state clearly here that India-U.S. bilateral relations today are extremely strong, and they are driven by a trade and defense partnership. Dipanjan has talked about how defense partnerships have grown, people-to-people contacts, commonality of values, and I think most importantly the need to work together to handle geopolitical challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. And these challenges are primarily sort of driven by the rise of China. But having said that, it does not mean that, on all areas and India and US views are completely aligned. And therefore, I want to take 3 recent geopolitical events, as I said, which will give us a look at what the opportunities are and what the challenges are. And the first of these events is the Russia-Ukraine war. And there has been some criticism in the US and also in the West that India, as the largest democracy in the world, should have been more strident in its condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. India, on the other hand, and again, Dipanjan alluded to it, is conscious of the fact that Russia has been a long and a reliable strategic partner to India, and has also been the largest sort of weapons exporter to India. And it's not merely in terms of numbers that we say, okay, they've supplied so many tanks or so many aircraft or so many air defense guns, but also in terms of the kind of technology that has been given to us. Nobody else would have given a nuclear submarine on lease to India. Wasn't possible, and Russia did that. Apart from this long-standing strategic partnership, I think India also values, and the foreign minister has said this on a number of occasions, India values its strategic autonomy and is today reluctant to be forced into making choices that other countries want it to make. For example, don't buy the S-400 system. Please don't buy oil from so-and-so country. So these are things that India, because of its basic sort of thoughts on strategic autonomy, on remaining sort of, on not being allied to any one camp, this is something that I think the first challenge that India and US will have to navigate. That these differences over Russia, how can these be minimized? The second event, a geopolitical event I want to flag, is the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And we saw that this very hurried and somewhat chaotic withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan has actually led to the handing over of power to Taliban. And this has the potential to destabilize the region. And India is very much a part of the region. And this is a concern that we are seeing in India. And while we could say that, look, India is not directly impacted like some of regions, we are seeing some problems in Iran and Central Asian republics. But the fact is, as I said, India being part of the region, and if there is spread of instability, if there is spread of radicalization in the region, this is something that very much concerns India. There are also worries about how the US-Pakistan relationship will move forward, and whether the US will continue to pay attention to India's concern over Pak-sponsored terrorism. See, let us not forget that India's views on what Pakistan was doing with regard to terrorism coming across our borders into India, and how the US viewed it, was an irritant in US-India relations in the past. And I think this is something that we'll have to look forward in the future. You've already seen that there is some sort of dissatisfaction over the F-16 modernization that has been done. So again, these are areas over Afghanistan, instability over the future of US-Pakistan relations is also something that we will have to navigate as we look at the future. And the third area I want to flag is the recent trajectory of India-China relations. And we have seen that in the last 2 years, India-China relations have deteriorated during the kind of situation that has happened along the LAC since May, June of 2020. And what this has resulted in is, we are seeing a shift of India moving closer to the US. We are seeing a shift in the strengthening of the Quad mechanism. So I think there are opportunities here to evolve for India and the US and find common ground to see that a rising China does not impose a kind of a hegemonic order in Asia that will be disadvantageous both to India as will also dilute US influence and power in the region. So I think it's in our common interest to see what is the way we need to deal with China. And frankly, this is not going to be easy. So it's just not a one-sided kind of a solution that we can come to. Because it is also clear that India is not going to run unabashedly into the US camp or come into some alliances, with the US against China. India would like to manage its relations with China in a manner that it does not result in open hostilities, and that it does not prevent India from its focus on, what is India's focus? It's on economic growth, on the betterment of its people. And so it also doesn't want relations with China to deteriorate to such an extent that there's open hostilities along the LAC. So there are both opportunities and challenges with what we are seeing today is the state of India and India and China relations. So I will just end my first sort of round here. And what I will do in the second round is that we've heard the challenges, we've seen the opportunities. What are the ways in which we can move forward over the next decade, to strengthen our relations better? So, Dipanjan, I will end here. Thank you very much.
You still have time, General.
I do. I will take the second part later.
Okay. Can we come to Mr. Vickery? I mean, for his views, I know a view from DC. I mean, as how you and probably a more holistic view, if I say without without the usual. I mean, a non-politician's view. I would say. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Mr. Chaudhury, and thanks to CUTS for putting this fourth workshop together. Particularly, Bipul has done great service here in Washington, so I'm happy to be here today. I've been asked to comment on three areas. The first is the 75 years of history between independence and now of India. Second, 25 years going forward. I've also been asked to comment on the legacy of the U.S. India civil nuclear deal. And finally, on the question of the ability to have strategic autonomy. That's impossible to do in 7 minutes, but I'll give it my best shot. First of all, I think in terms of history, we need to look back further than 75 years. Minister Jayashankar has said on several occasions that there was 200 years of humiliation of India by the West. Presumably what he means by that is the British Empire days. The United States was not part of the British Empire. We fought 2 wars against the British for our own independence, and we're not responsible for having done that. So to have that kind of background bleed into U.S.-India relations, it seems to me, is a mistake. If you look at the period since independence, I think the first point is that there really are 2 different eras, and I would classify those eras as from 47 and not to the civil nuclear deal in 2005, but to 1991. And 1991 is absolutely crucial for the strategic relationship because that was the year that the Soviet Union collapsed. And the vaunted friendship and ability to get arms and so forth was very much deteriorated. It was also the year in which the economy of India collapsed. And it opened the way by doing away with the license Raj and building socialism in one country, the whole top-down economic system, for the U.S. And India to be able to interchange and cooperate across the board. So I think that 1991 is the key time. And just as I wouldn't go back to the 200-year history of British colonialism, it seems to me that the period from 47 to 91 should be taken with a grain of salt. As we all know, it was up and down. In 1962, the United States came to back India when China actually invaded. On the other hand, there was the Enterprise aircraft carrier incident in 1991. And you can talk about ups and downs in terms of Green Revolution, PL 480, and other aspects of it. But the real period is not to get hung up about that, but look forward in terms of what has happened since 1991. That brings us, it seems to me, to how the United States has actually behaved, particularly in regard to China and to Pakistan. In 1999, there was the Kargil invasion from Pakistan, and it was plain that the United States stood with India on that. In 9/11, the cooperation on terrorism from wherever it came, whether it came from Pakistan cross-border or any other place, we began a great cooperation on that. And then, of course, the great breakthrough was 2005 to 2008 when the Indian-U.S. civil nuclear deal was put into place. And that really wasn't about civil nuclear so much as it was the strategic relationship of the United States willing to look at its most sacred technology, if you will, in terms of nuclear technology, and work with India to bring India into a de facto nuclear posture. And that has opened up a whole realm of change in terms of technological transfer. Now it seems to me we come to the modern era, and the general has adequately outlined the areas of concern. And it seems to me that there is a tension in India's foreign policy and its strategic posture between its ideals, which have been expressed by Prime Minister Modi, of this is not an era of war. This is an era of democracy, diplomacy, and negotiation. And looking at what Russia has done in the greatest transgression of international law and the rule of law to which India subscribes since World War II. All countries have signed on to the UN Charter, saying you won't use force to take territory from anyone else. And what has happened is Russia has transgressed that and thrown us into a completely unique area since World War II. It does not seem to me that that can be swept under the rug. It is for India as a great power with worldwide interest to decide what it will do. But I would submit to you that the strategic values of defending democracy, of having non-aggression, to trying to build peace and stability and the rule of law is a very strong factor, and that India must come to grips with that, as the U.S. Must as well. It seems to me that in strategic matters, it's very important to look, of course, at China and Pakistan, but not to look at them just in terms of the border transgressions, but what it means for building peace and stability in the world. China claims an entire Indian state, Arunachal Pradesh. It has even from time to time said that prime ministers and other high-ranking Indian officials should not even go to its own Indian state. It requires a stapling of a concession to Chinese control for people who have passports there. And the U.S. and India have an obvious strategic convergence there. But it can't be just on a basis of, well, we're just going to try to maintain borders. It has to be on the broader question of values, which I have alluded to before. Now, there is no question that India is in some sense dependent upon Russia for arms, 46% of all the imports, technology transfer. But that does not mean that that dependence is strategic autonomy. In fact, it becomes strategic dependence if it's overdone. It is up to the United States and India to find ways to meet that challenge of where India gets its arms and where they're coming from in advanced technology. And that is going forward, both with France and other NATO partners, Israel, to be able to meet that challenge. I don't think anybody is asking India just to drop its own strategic interest in terms of where it gets its arms, but it is asking to take a look at it and to take a look at where it stands in accordance with its own values. In terms of trade, it seems to me that we have an additional challenge. The numbers are all up, and it is very plain that India's interest in terms of trade, investment, economic engagement come with its other democracies, and that means the U.S. It is far more important that relationship be nurtured and go forward, and that's the reason I hope that India will take an even more active role in the framework which has been initiated. To conclude, and I don't know how much of my 7 minutes I've used, Mr. Moderator, but it is important for these two greatest democracies on earth not just to cooperate on immediate border questions, territorial concerns, movement of ships in the Indian Ocean. But in the broader picture of what it is that we're trying to do as the two greatest democracies on earth, to promote peace and stability, the rule of law, and democracy internationally. People do not fight and die just for borders and just for territorial control. What they want and what people motivates people in the field, our soldiers, our sailors, our Marines, are the values that the country stands for. And I think that that needs to be a fundamental part of the strategic posture of both the United States and India.
Thank you, Mr. Vickery. I mean, you have made a point. I will come back to you later where I would speak about the technology transfer. I mean, how can India and US navigate these bilateral challenges and as well as geopolitical challenges? Let me now move to Dr. Mukherjee. He's formerly with IDSA and now based in Singapore for many years. And for a view, and he's done a seminal work on the Indian Ocean region and Indo-Pacific region. Come back, I mean, to hear his views. Sitting in Singapore, how do you, I mean, look at? Do you look at this relationship the way a Singaporean would look at it? I mean, consensus. I mean, balancing well between like they do between China and the U.S. I mean, how do you see the Indo-US relationship has evolved and can evolve, not just in the Indo-Pacific, and there where I guess there is now convergence in terms of how the two countries are moving, but in hard defense technology transfer, because you are also an ex-serviceman.
Thank you so much, Dipanjan. It is so good to be here. Both earlier speakers were excellent. It's a very difficult act to follow. Firstly, I'll say this. I'm speaking as an Indian. I would not speak about the Singaporean perspective. So I'll speak to this issue as an Indian. So I wouldn't know too much about. So I'm sure that Singapore has got its own views about India and the US, but I'd speak about India and America itself. I think, as was augmented by the last speaker, the issue that fundamentally gets India and America to kind of unite together is on interests alone. When we get the issue of values into the picture, then it can become a pretty charged debate, right? Because when we talk about values, then it becomes charged because that can take you down a slippery slope. What are these values? Are we talking about? Is it democracy? Is it like the rules-based order as defined by whom, order as shaped by whom, order as shaped by the United Nations Security Council, for instance, where India is not a permanent member. So as opposed to this idea of, as two of the greatest democracies, big democracies, people-to-people contact, open societies, all those are important points. By all means, they are extremely important points. They are not to be overlooked. The fact that India and America, if you look at the people-to-people contacts, that's very, very significant. When Indians go to America and see the Indian Americans doing so well, as Americans come to India, they enjoy the openness of Indian society, of Indian media, of the Indian public space. And I think there is a sort of a congruence of the countries here. That's extremely important. But ultimately, from a realist perspective, it is actually about interests. And here's where I would go with the interests argument, that the interests align. The interests don't align perfectly, right? As was argued earlier. On certain issues, we don't see eye to eye completely. It could be about Pakistan, it could be about Afghanistan, it could be about Iran, it could be about Ukraine, it could be about other issues where we don't see eye to. It could be about climate change. It could be about trade. I think, bottom line, the best friendships are shaped by, in a case where the interests are what bind them. And on this count, I would say that India, America, because the interests align, mainly because of China. everything else, as I've just said, right? We could have tactical disagreements about Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Ukraine, Russia, but ultimately what unites India and America is shared concern about the rise of China. And I think that's the first point I would want to make, that look, we should take the relationship forward in the best way possible that suits America's interests and India's interests. If by and by our values push us forward where we can request each other to stay up to the values, and both countries have not lived up to the values at certain times in the past, even in the current, because I'm sure people can take issue with India, with America, with the way we are dealing with the diversity internally as well as with other countries. So I would go with the interests matter, interests unite us. We should argue on that point alone. The second point I wanted to speak to was US-India on the mill-to-mill ties. Here's where I'm extremely bullish about the state of the relationship. And here's where I would say, look, the best way to think about this is to think about the mill-to-mill ties in 5 years duration. Because if we think about where we are in 2022, then we ignore the fact of where we started this from. And we could go back to 1947, 1971, to the Kargil War. But I think the best place to start is, let's say, 2000 onward. So 2002 to where we were in 2007 to 2012, 2017, 2022. When we look at it in 5-year terms, I think the mill-to-mill and the defense relationship has been going from strength to strength. This includes from defense trade to the fact that the two armed forces are exercising so much. They're doing it, I think, all over the world across all three services, and this is generating a lot of trust. The Indian military is operating a fair degree of American equipment, and I think America should let its equipment do its talking, as opposed to come to India and say, buy this and buy that. I think as the Indian armed forces get used to the high standards of American equipment, by and by, there would be greater demand in India to say that, look, this is something that we need more of. And again, if you look at the relationship in 5 years duration, that's a better way to think about it. And on that count, I think we have come significantly forward. And that's what I share General Hooda's optimism there, that if you think about the next 5 to 10 years, I can see only scope for growth. And the third point I would make is, having been a part of the Indian military, having done my PhD in the U.S., and then been at IDSA for 2 years, wonderful years at IDSA. So I know a little bit about India and the US. I would say that, and I keep going back and forth between DC and Delhi, I would say that while the think tank community and the analyst community and the journalist community may have certain views about it, at the government to government level, they're doing far much more than what we think outside the government. That it's a far stronger engagement, it's a far stronger relationship where they are talking honestly about their disagreements, where they're talking honestly about the way forward, where they're talking honestly about, things that divide them as well as unite them. So in that count, at the government to government level, there's a fair degree of, I think, open speak between the two governments that should give a scope for encouragement in the future also. And the fourth point, and I would end it at that, and then we can go back and forth on this, is I agree with the point that Ray made, which is, if India refused to condemn the Ukraine invasion because we are dependent upon Russia for arms and equipment, that's not a good look for India's strategic autonomy. Right? That does not make India look good, that India is not able to come across and condemn forcefully what is an outright case of invasion because we are dependent upon Russia for our weapons and equipment. At the same point of time, that should not be an excuse to say, well, if we depend upon Moscow too much, then we are not able to take an independent position, and hence we need to switch our dependency to whether it is America or France or Israel. That will come with its own baggage. And so I think what India needs to really focus upon is what has been spoken about, Atmanirbharta Bharat, the sort of self-indigenization process. Now, this cannot happen overnight because Indian domestic capabilities are just not there. But I think this government's approach to privatize, to seek FDI, creates an avenue for potential cooperation between India and the US. And the best way forward for that potential defense industrial cooperation is to have greater trust between the Americans and the Indians, where there are some concerns, and these are not completely irrational. There are some legitimate concerns in America about India's information security, right? The ability, and it's not because India would, let's say, leak the information because India wants to leak the information. But there are concerns that the Indian information security, defense industry, other agencies might be compromised to cyber theft, to outside interests who could be able to steal those industrial secrets. So here's where I think India and US needs to engage in a greater dialogue and greater trust building exercise so that Indians can, again, you don't expect the Americans to come and share the crown jewel kind of technology with the Indians from the get-go. But that's the sort of ambition that we should be thinking about 5 to 10 years from now. I would end it at this, and we can go back and forth again after this. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. I think there are a couple of valid points and also certain things I'm not here to present my views, but I would sort of agree. But I guess that Indian position on Ukraine is not just to do with its dependence on the Russian arms, and General Hooda would know. And it is a larger Eurasian play. It's not just the arms supplies from Russia. And with regard to the industrial secrets, I think that France has worked very well with India on this in terms of again, I'm not an military expert, but the Mirage and the MiGs have functioned simultaneously, and both were confident, and there would be no leakage from that. So I don't understand what is the hesitation from the American side on this. I mean, I had heard an argument that India would not, US would not sell F-35 to India because India is getting S-400, which is a very sophisticated system and can catch. But I believe India has never thought of buying F-35. That it is not even in the reckoning of the Indian establishment, because it's too costly for an Indian defense budget at this moment. In the next round, I would like to hear more about joint production. That's what India is looking at, and where is it heading to. Now let me welcome Dr. Rao. You are an expert on Eurasia, Europe, Japan, where you have spent considerable of time, and Australia. You were initially hesitant to come on this, but I said that I know your work, and I'm sure that you will do justice to. You would bring a perspective which is beyond that. Of course, beyond my kind of domain knowledge, but also a perspective which would bring the European perspective to the Indo-US relations, because one would see Europe as largely a Western allied countries, and therefore how do they look at it, and how do they think that Indo-US relations shall go forward? Yeah.
Well, thank you. I hope I'm audible. So a very good evening to everyone, and also good morning to the gentleman who's joining us from the United States. Well, yes, first of all, thank you, Kutz, for inviting me, and thank you, Dipanjan, for such a kind introduction. One of the problems that happens when you're speaking last on a panel is that the most important points have already been conveyed. But like you said, that I have been asked to bring about a different perspective, which is about what Europe is doing, because you see right now this this major geopolitical shift in terms of the security architecture being destroyed, etc. All of that is happening in Europe. So obviously, what is happening in Europe has completely upended their security calculus along with others. So I think let me start there, and I have about 7 minutes. I'll time myself.
Yeah,
and in the first part of my engagement, right now, I'll focus on 3 points here. First is, and it's also given in the flyer, so I'll kind of restrict myself to that and maybe take up more interesting questions later. The first is that, what is this multilateralism in the Indo-Pacific, the way it's emerging? And, I'll get into that. The second, perhaps, is something that I've been working on for a longer time now. And it's something that I feel that if I don't put, then there is no analytical framework in which we can understand as to what is happening, and which is that I see there has started to be a merging of these two security architectures, the transatlantic and the Indo-Pacific, and the reasons why I think and say so, along with a lot of other scholars who make similar arguments. And third, what I'll do in the first part is that I'll try and declutter this crowded, complex space of all these initiatives, and then in the second part, subsequently later. So, taking first, if you look at multilateralism, of course, and the way the security environment is rapidly changing, the Indo-Pacific construct is definitely being increasingly internationalized. Okay, and in such an environment, both joint initiatives, what they do is that they offer means to underscore shared normative goals and not just common threat perceptions. I mean, if you look at all these initiatives that are coming up in the Indo-Pacific, part of those are also about addressing threat perceptions, which are more directly related with security. Okay, India may not be a part of that, at least at the outset, or openly externally, but then there are those that are related with the threat perceptions, and then there are others that are only talking about the normative goals, whether it's climate or COVID-19 and the COVID vaccines, or perhaps the resilient supply chains and etc., the clean and green energies, etc. So that's one. Well, the thing is that U.S. containment of China is most obvious in the Indo-Pacific, and through initiatives like the Quad, the B3W, I think it got a new name in the recent G7, which happened this year. The Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing arrangement between the Anglophone countries, of course, AUKUS, okay, and the IPEF, from where India has chosen to stay away, and a whole host of other bilateral and trilateral arrangements. So the point is, what is the role of Europe, right? I mean, there have already been points that have been reiterated. What is the point? I mean, I don't really see any point of going back and sort of mapping the importance of U.S. India defense cooperation, or all the cooperation that started from 2016, the various logistical agreements that were signed. I think we are all there. It's all established. Let me now directly come to what is the role of Europe. See, considering the evolving security landscape, Europe is aware that both connectivity and partnerships will play a critical role as the spotlight transitions from hard to soft elements and back to hard elements again in the backdrop of the Ukraine war. So, what I see is that the European Commission is trying to take on this geopolitical hue. Its president, Ursula von der Leyen, has kind of realized that if you want to increase EU's global footprint to help Brussels gain the formidable traction it requires in the global order, especially today, it really has to look at Indo-Pacific, okay? And also, let's understand that when we talk about EU's development or Europe's development and its strategic stances in the Indo-Pacific, you have to see it from the prism of a shared competence between not just the EU itself, but the Commission, but also the 27 member states. And secondly, embracing the Indo-Pacific wholeheartedly as a crucial geopolitical construct has also not come naturally, okay, to the EU. Of course, the point that Dipanjan was making earlier, that earlier it was, the distant geographical location. Indo-Pacific did not receive as much spotlight, despite the fact that they had Indo-Pacific doctrines and all that, coming out from 2021 onwards. But the point is that, and then Brexit had further diminished this, because, the French and British territories were, and their military stations were looked upon as the major engagements. But then after Brexit, sort of, Europe, and at least the mainland Europe, was kind of, rather alone in it. But the point is that the fact that Brussels was not trying to side either with the US or China, okay, despite that new sense of realism that was dawning upon, if you look at 2021, etc., that kind of a thing definitely got changed because of the Russia-Ukraine war. So now there are critical drivers why Europe is not only engaging the Indo-Pacific, but also is a major player in realms of upping its strategic presence. And there are a whole host of things. I would rather take questions on it, to protecting its economic interests and providing technical cooperation in maritime domain awareness or intelligence sharing. The second point that I wanted to make about that analytical framework that I was saying that I've been working on, which is that why do I say that the two security architectures of transatlantic and Indo-Pacific have been merging? See, the first thing is, let's face it, there is a scarcity of resources. And then the Russian war in Ukraine has definitely upended the security calculus of the Europeans, who have started to now worry about their economic security in the other side of the world. And nothing is more, is more indicative of it as the NATO's Madrid summit this year, where NATO partners from across Asia Pacific had joined for the first time, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Australia, perhaps New Zealand also. And secondly, that China was categorically mentioned for the first time. So in my opinion, I think there is a sense that NATO is trying to rethink its threat countering strategy, trying to sort of expand about, its calculus about how to sort of deal with all the threats that are there. And without including the Indo-Pacific in its fold, the story seems rather incomplete. So by merging the two security architectures, NATO is realigning not only its existential rationale, but also being more efficient in countering threats as security traverses into the domain of the hybrid, this data churning, intelligence sharing, technical aspects, like I just mentioned, the maritime situational awareness capabilities. And, NATO and EU really have, I think, formidable capabilities here. So if you then look at this entire Indo-Pacific domain with the security architectures, meeting or converging, then you see the NATO's capabilities of MDA and MSA along with EU's capabilities of MDA and MSA. They would really strengthen the maritime security architecture of the Indo-Pacific, which is really required for actually upholding a rules-based international order, which is at the heart of all that we are trying to do with with these various initiatives that we are trying to sort of understand and analyze today. So the question is how to do it effectively. Now that we've understood that we need to do it, but how to do it effectively. I will take it up again in the later part of it. I think it's a work in progress, of course. And just very briefly, the third thing is that we definitely need to declutter the crowded, complex space of initiatives in the Indo-Pacific, where what I'll stop with is that the thing that we need to remember is that mapping convergences is key. There can be no two nations with an identical set of foreign policy goals and objectives. So we need to sort of map how far are we converging and work on those. So the various initiatives that are listed, and I'll be talking about it in the later part of my engagement, that the various initiatives should be looked upon as complementing rather than competing. And this convergence should be mapped in layers of engagement, almost like concentric circles. And in the second part, I'll tell you what I think when I say the layers of engagement. I think that the core should be identified. For example, the resilient economics or maritime security, defense, and these should be supported through multiple axes. And I have worked out a couple of multiple axes where I feel where the bigger players can converge and what should be the priority of engagement there. So whether it's Quad, Europe's Indo-Pacific engagement, the global gateway, the different multilaterals, bilaterals, trilaterals, and the triangular cooperations, all of that need some sort of a priority or prioritization. So with this, let me sort of end my first engagement, here, and then I look forward to the second one. Thank you for your patience and hearing me out.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. You brought a different perspective altogether, and we will again hear, in the second round. Can I invite General Hooda again for his? He really had a very crisp first round. I could elaborate, and if you could, of course, you have spoken about the China threat. If you could talk a little more about the, joint production possibilities and the transfer of technology, Dr. Hooda. How do you see that evolving in the coming years? The hesitations, of course, will there, and as Dr. Rao mentioned, the two sides can never have identical foreign policy or security even approaches. How in these, as we progress in the relations and in the next decade, as you had mentioned at the beginning of your, how do you see the prospects of joint defense production?
Okay, thanks, Dipanjan. I'll talk about joint defense production also, but I think there's the need to look at it in a slightly larger context. But let me just quickly, I want to make 4 quick points. You see, if we are looking at strengthening bilateral relations between India and US over the next decade or so, it has to be built on greater understanding and greater trust. So I just want to make 4 points. My first point is there is a need to minimize differences and maximize opportunities. And these opportunities, as Anit has brought out, these opportunities are due to common interests. I completely agree with them. Talk about values and all is good, but ultimately we have to see where common interests are aligned. And again, as he brought out, it's clear that both India and the US need each other in view of China's increasing aggressiveness, its growing power, and it suits both our interests. I mean, you are seeing now, clearly the US is articulating China as its sort of primary opponent. It's a part of the great power rivalry that is playing out, in particularly in the Indo-Pacific. India obviously does not want to see China achieving hegemony in Asia, because that then again limits India's choices and what they can do. And so there is common interest here. Now you could have national interests differing in small ways, but at least on China, I think both countries are aligned. And therefore, again, as Anit brought out, there is a need to have an open, multi-layered dialogue and take each other into confidence, have greater information sharing, have greater intelligence sharing. And I agree again with Anit when he says, the view from the pages of newspapers and TV channels is somewhat different from how the two governments are sort of interacting with each other. And therefore, need for greater engagement, as I said. And if possible, sudden unilateral actions by either side could be avoided, which sort of tend to sometimes surprise the other side. The second point I want to make is that I think there is a need to understand risks and costs. There is a feeling in India that an overtly aggressive Indo-Pacific strategy carries certain risks and costs for India. We have an unsettled border. That unsettled border with China is a place where the PLA can apply certain pressure. And this pressure has not only sort of reputational costs of how India reacts, it has political costs. Please see what happens when there is a minor intrusion by China across the LAC. The kind of pressure that is put on the political leadership is enormous. So we need to understand that, yes, there are risks and there are costs for India when it engages openly in some kind of action that China views as hostile. And therefore, this is something that US policymakers must understand when they ask India to do much more in the maritime domain. And I'm not saying the maritime domain is unimportant, it's important. But I think India's sort of concerns of the continental domain, the risks and costs should also be clearly understood. The third point I want to make is, see, ultimately, it's the balance of power which will decide the geopolitical trajectory of countries in Asia. Now, if China becomes too powerful, if the power differential between China and India becomes too much, if the US power weakens in Asia, obviously it will impact India's choices. And therefore, I think it is the interest of the US to see that this power differential between India and China does not become too much, does not become so much that we are restricted in the choices that India needs to make. And this is where the point you were making about assistance in the US defense industry, the Indian defense industry, assistance in technology. It is clear, both from our sort of over-dependence on Russia and on the performance of Russian weapon systems in Ukraine, that we are going to probably have to look at other alternatives. And this is where the US can actually step in and assist us. Not only you buy this from us, but in what India is doing, Atmanirbhar Bharat, the fact that we want to indigenize our defense industry, the US certainly has both the capacities, the technology, the ability to assist India in this regard. And this is one place that they must do. The other is in the area of technology. What we are seeing today in terms of technology is that you're seeing there's talk about a technology Cold War between the US and China. There's talk about, how there is going to be technology decoupling. India, unfortunately, despite whatever it says, the fact is it's its adoption of high technologies, manufacture of high technology, its spending on research and development is minimal. And so I think this is one area where the US can assist India in the adoption of in the adoption of high technology in various sectors, in various fields, and finally in sort of shifting of supply chains, etc. to India. So there are numerous areas where I think the US and India need to partner together. And again, I say, with the idea that the power differential, both economic, military, technology, between the two countries should not become so large that it starts restricting India's choices on how it needs to respond, etc. And my final point is, I think India will also have to reassess its relations with countries like Russia as we go ahead in the future. I mean, nobody in India is sort of supporting what Russia did in Ukraine. I mean, it was obviously naked aggression, which is not acceptable. And so we will have to, as we go forward, reassess our relations with countries like Russia. I think also reassess how far we wish to take this whole idea of strategic autonomy. And I'm saying reassess this idea because as we look into the future, and this is my view, there is not going to be a single country which is going to be able to handle China's challenge on its own. And therefore, you will need to look at groupings. I'm not using the word alliances, but you will need to come together with various countries. And so how does that sort of match up to your idea of completely maintaining strategic autonomy? Is something that we'll have to, I think, look at. And some of the lingering suspicions on both sides. I mean, Raymond mentioned some issues, and I had mentioned some issues about how there are still some areas of suspicion that need to be addressed, again, as Anit said, through a very transparent dialogue, which articulate each other's respective national security. So I will finish here, Dipanjan, and take any other issues during the Q&A session.
I would like to, hear his views from DC on the issue of what's holding back the technology transfer of critical items. I mean, nobody in the world gives the top of the state of the technology. I mean, howsoever close even US, I'm sure, doesn't share that with Japan or Australia. And I think it's by and large clear to the US establishment that India will not be a treaty ally of the US. So how can we work this out?
To whom are you addressing that question?
Mr. Vickery, to you. Yeah.
To me?
Yeah.
Well, I think that it has to be worked out. The United States is clear as recently as this past month that it considers India an indispensable partner. And it is just as clear, though, that you can't just say, well, all technologies are completely open. The question is, where is there a hang-up or an impediment to being able to have a relationship which becomes the two largest democracies in the world? And it seems to me that we've made a tremendous amount of progress, particularly since 2005, in changing our own regulations and laws to accommodate technology transfer. If there are specific areas in which the restrictions are holding up the military and defense capabilities, I'd like to know about them, because in my experience in dealing with United States government officials, they don't see these areas in which there are real hang-ups in doing what both countries have said that they want to get done. And I would like just to reiterate, though, that when we're talking about values and interests, those are very slippery terms. And the question is, how does India define its interests? Do its interests include values such as the rule of law, non-aggression, and those things which are set forth not by the United States, but by the international community in the United Nations Charter? And it's really up to India to decide, is it truly a great world power? And looking at what happens in Europe as well as what happens on its own borders as crucial to its own security? Or is it regionally focused and it's focused only on these borders? The other point I'd like to make is that this idea that we're going to consider defense military interest separate from the rest of the relationship, it seems to me is fundamentally wrong. If you look at the history of U.S. India relations, the fact that we were able to have economic engagement very much affected the strategic relationship. The fact is that in the real world, there is no such thing as divisions which are hard and fast between what are our military defense interests and what happens in the economic, cultural, and relationships fields across the board. So it seems to me that we need to be able to take into account that really the world is smaller, that Europe is not really separate from Asia, and that there is only one reality, and that reality includes both military, economic, and cultural values, which have to be worked on simultaneously to have a strong partnership.
We will again come back to you, I guess, if there's a question. Can I now ask Dr. Mukherjee to?
Thank you so much, Dipanjan. Just for me, Anit, please. Dr. Mukherjee is like, it's just got to be. A couple of points I want to make is, firstly, on the U.S. India defense technology thing here, I think it's very difficult primarily because if you look at U.S. defense industry, it's private sector owned, right? It's not owned by the government. And the US does not really have a model where we think about its industry going out and creating facilities for defense production in other countries. It does have a little bit of that with Japan and the UK, but not anything beyond that. So I think the Indian expectation that American defense companies would come to, let's say, Indian state-owned firms and help DRDO the way it has been helped by the Israelis or the French or the Russians might be a little difficult. And here's where I think, look, I mean, because the Americans are not used to that approach, it becomes really hard to kind of disentangle what is the potential, because ultimately the Indians come and say, we need top-end technology for DRDO and DPSUs and HAL, and the Americans are like, but you don't have the capabilities, and we don't really do that with any other countries unless we find an alliance partnership or some sort of a agreement so that we are sure that the Indians will not leak it. And here's where I think you have a point about this kind of Dipanjan, that there have been not, I don't think that there are too many overt instances where we know that Indians have leaked information or industrial espionage has occurred where Indian systems are compromised, but that fear does exist, right? That fear does exist. And again, if I'm a country that has extremely sensitive equipment or technology that we do not want to part with, then, and we're not sure about the sort of facilities on the Indian side, then that concern has been raised by the American industry and at the DoD level. Whether it's true or not is a matter of perception. And so here, I think as opposed to kind of going over and over in circles, the best way forward is to think about private sector defense industry as the best way to encourage cooperation between India and America. And that's already occurring to a certain extent. If you look at what the Tatas are doing with the Boeing they have set up facilities which are pretty good. And I think here's where, as opposed to India saying, give to DRDO or DPSUs, the best way forward is what the Indian government is trying to do right now, which is create conditions for the private sector to come to the fore, because that competition would automatically enhance the effectiveness of the industry. The fact that we have had a state-owned defense industrial base that hasn't worked out to a certain extent is mainly because we don't spend as much on R&D as pointed out by General kind of Hooda. We don't have kind of competition within India. And third is, so I think that creates an opportunity where I think India and America should explore that opportunity a bit more. On the other bit about the larger point about India-US relationships, again, as I said, I think I'm pretty bullish about the prospects of it, primarily because our interests are aligned. They do not perfectly align. But I also think, if anything else, this conversation is also indicative of the fact that we definitely need to do more of such events. So CUTS needs to take this initiative a bit more forward. I would end it here for the time being. Thank you.
Dr. Rao, you wanted to, share some views which you said that you do it in the second round.
Oh, well, yes, it's become quite interesting. There was there's so much discussion, and Amit was just talking, so much sense about the defense cooperation and the hurdles and etc. And since I just recently worked on that, I'm so tempted to say something which is not really directly related with what I'm doing today on Indo-Pacific and Europe's engagement there. But yes, for definitely, before I sort of venture into what I wanted to say, definitely, the fact that India needs to, there are areas that we need to identify and sort of try and rectify. You see, just by giving a model of Atmanirbhar Bharat, the Atmanirbharta will not come. Telling the Western allies, whether it's the US or Europe or France or whoever, Sweden or whoever we have deep defense relations with, that we would like to transcend the buyer-seller paradigm and get into TOT, etc. It's not going to come, because you see, the problem is that why is it that we have such deep relations with Russia? One of the reasons is that we of course understand that we need to diversify and all of that, but one of the reasons why it's not really worked, because India has to give up its lowest bidder mindset, which usually Russia hogs generally if you want to diversify. That's one. And I think there's a lot of development which is happening there, so I won't get into details, but yeah, that is one area which I identify. The second thing, especially with Europeans, there are times when the Europeans do finish as the lowest bidders, but still the plans don't go ahead, because whenever it is about supporting the ancillary units in India, Indians and the red tapeism and the bureaucratic hurdles and all of that, Russians are somehow extremely flexible when it comes to supporting ancillary units and joint productions of whatever defense equipment we're talking about, whereas for the Europeans, they would like to have their say. Okay, and that is the reason that a lot of times, even when they finish as last bidders, the lowest bidders, the deals do not come through. So, these are things that India needs to work on. We need to sort of become more efficient, and there are ways in which we can become more efficient. And only then that, we can involve the private players, and all of this happens at a parallel level. Well, things like convincing the Europeans and the Americans that an empowered India is in the long-term interest of the US and Europe. Oh yes, it sounds great, but then there are things that we need to really do back home, without which, this kind of a statement would always sound extremely loose and extremely, I would say diffuse. So that's one. And now coming back to when I was talking about the Indo-Pacific and where we can deepen our engagement, and particularly looking at US, India, and the Indo-Pacific, I think one region that really stands out, and I was surprised that Amit didn't mention it despite he's sitting in Singapore, is the factor of ASEAN centrality. All these major powers are engaging with countries within ASEAN, particularly Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia, because all the major sea lanes of communication, they are falling under these countries' jurisdictions. Okay, so within ASEAN, of course, we understand that China divides ASEAN, but within ASEAN there are these three countries, and there's not so much time I might like to take it in the question answer session. But within Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia within ASEAN are the countries where we need to really deepen our engagement with. Now, of course, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the European Union is doing, or the European Union's Indo-Pacific strategy is resting on the economic cornerstone of what is the global gateway and what they are doing with it. And I mean, that's one. The other thing I wanted to talk about is IPEF and India's decision to stay out from the IPEF is, I mean, it really, I understand why India did it, but then it's really not in the long-term interest, because you see, IPEF is one of the major, so to say, thrusts of the Biden administration to repivot to Southeast Asia. So that was one, and that's somewhere I feel is something that we need to work on. And the third thing is that even if you look at countries like UK and all, the fact that they are focusing on Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia, particularly Singapore and Malaysia, because UK is there as they have a 5-power defense agreement with the ASEAN countries. And if you look within, you will again see why Singapore and Malaysia are important, etc. So I don't have so much time here, but all I'm trying to sort of perhaps say is that and the other way, maybe the last point that I'd like to make is that the other way, we all understand that whoever our strategic partners and allies are, one of the ways in which we can deepen cooperation is really working hard on our bilateral, cooperation and bilateral, so to say, development of, shared interests, okay, basically. But the other thing that we can definitely do is that we can look at better detail at something called the triangular cooperation. Triangular cooperation is when these two actors are finding or cooperating in a third area. So for example, we've been talking about it, but at least I'm happy that it's taking center stage now in the global discourse. So for example, India and the EU working together in Africa, or for example, since 2019, India and United States, they signed the first amendment to the SGP, is it called, the Statement of Guiding Principles, on triangular cooperation for global development in Asia and Africa as part of the Indo-Pacific cooperation. So I think the initial point that I was trying to make is that, well, there is a whole host of initiatives within the Indo-Pacific, ranging from a whole, so to say, variety. But then we need to prioritize, we need to look at the core areas, and then also find out, apart from enriching our bilateral cooperation, whether it's economics, we didn't have the time to talk about economics, okay, which is basically where everything else rests, okay. So economics or defense, we can also talk about third party and the triangular cooperation networks, and that is the way I look at the Europeans making sense of their Indo-Pacific engagement, which is only going to grow bigger with time. So the Europeans are here to stay, and I think this is perhaps the right time for, like, everybody is perhaps seems to be on the same page as me, so that we need to sort of map more convergences and find out better strategies, and so be it. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. Yeah. We just have now around 17 minutes left, and I have a couple of questions. Some are very direct to the panelists, some are not. So let me start with the first one. I think Dr. Mukherjee can go on this, which is that Mohammed Fahim from the University of Bangkok, he's written on that how the US is important to India's Indo-Pacific strategy. A very general question, but I think you are better suited to answer this.
That's a great question, how the US is important to India's Indo-Pacific strategy. I think among the things that we have to acknowledge is that America is among the most important Indo-Pacific players, right? By virtue of its presence across the Indo-Pacific, from Japan to Diego Garcia, it is on either ends of the Indo-Pacific. When we talk about countries in the region, when we talk about Australia, Japan, Taiwan, when we talk even about ASEAN, we can talk about Singapore, Philippines, Thailand, India itself, all these countries in some ways, if you ask them who their top 3 partners or who their top 3 foreign policy interlocutors are at the economic level, at the people-to-people level, at the ideational level, at the defense level, I think the answer would be America. So I don't think it would be a surprise. I don't think it'll be an overstatement to say that America is among the most, in fact, America is among the most important players across the Indo-Pacific. And that's why, I mean, it's important to India when India thinks about its own Indo-Pacific strategy. So, and I think it's not also an open secret that it's after America started to take India seriously post the sort of the 2005, even post the Jaswant Singh talks that happened after the nuclear test. It's after America started to take India seriously that other countries also took India seriously and were keen to have an India strategy. And that's true about Australia for sure, that's true about Japan for sure, but that's true also about the ASEAN countries, because it piqued everybody's interest, including perhaps to a certain extent, even Beijing's interests, that why is America? So I think on this count, that's a great aspect of the India-America relationship. If I could take this time to just come back on the ASEAN centrality bit, I think it's a really good kind of point, Dr. Rao. I'm just, having been in Singapore, and this is not an indictment of just being here, I'm still struggling to figure out what ASEAN centrality is. I know that we make a lot of diplomatic statements about it, and everybody, and Indians say it all the time, ASEAN, but figuring out when ASEAN is so fundamentally compromised in some ways, and it is an open secret, right? I mean, it is so that it's very difficult, and even ASEAN countries themselves are figuring out whether it's on Myanmar, whether it's on Cambodia, how to take a position forward. And that's why I think, although it's great for diplomatic speak to talk about ASEAN centrality, from a strategic sense of, from a strategic point of view, I'm still struggle to figure out what ASEAN centrality means in actual tangible terms for a country's interests. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. There is a very pointed question to General Hooda. And this is an interesting question, which is from Subhangi. She's an editor with ET Prime. She's asking because of the, the current recession. And I know it may not be directly linked to you, but it's interesting nonetheless and pointed towards you that, the current global recession and the rupee's performance vis-a-vis the dollar, how it is going to impact Indo-US defense deals in terms of the India's, I guess she's looking at the India's purchasing power capabilities in an upcoming recession or in the middle of a recession. Yeah.
Well, look, the value of the rupee versus the dollar is going to have a impact on what you can buy and how much you have to pay. But I don't think that's really going to be a deal breaker if you are looking at getting some new technologies, etc., from the US. Just on the larger question of and a lot of people have talked about these defense deals and high technology equipment. One is, I think, with these 4 foundational agreements that were done, a lot of the issues concerning, how technology will be handled, some of those issues have been resolved. So I'm not sure there is going to be, any kind of reluctance because now how the technology will be handled, transferred, what is the kind of information that you can share with each other. A lot of that work has already been done. I think the points made both by Dr. Rao and Anit. Does India have the ability to absorb this technology? And that, I think, is a big issue. And particularly when we're looking at Atmanirbhar, that everything now should be sort of manufactured in India, made in India. Is there the ability to absorb this kind of technology and to produce this technology in India? That is one issue, I think. And as Anit said, unless the private industry is, sort of incentivized, and right now it is frankly not incentivized enough, there is still this, thing of getting the DRDO and the DPSUs, sort of involved in all our defense production. So unless the defense industrial base itself grows strong, you have the ability to absorb technology, that is going to be a sort of a reluctant factor of how exactly the technology will be transferred. On your issue of interoperability, I will not completely dismiss this interoperability issue. After all, there are you can have full systems, you can have subsystems. How will you integrate these subsystems into equipment which is, say, Russian and American equipment sort of working together? I think there are going to be issues and concerns. You gave the example of F-35. Yes, we haven't asked for F-35. But tomorrow, if you want an American stealth aircraft and you have the S-400, it's going to be an issue. I mean, finally, the radar is going to pick up stealth characteristics almost on a daily basis of what's happening. So there are some interoperability issues, not many, but I think it's something that we cannot sort of dismiss. But just coming back, the short answer is, I don't think the value of dollar versus rupee is going to be a deal breaker if you have to buy something. I don't think that will be an issue.
Yeah. Samriddhi Roy from US IPF. I think this also Dr. Rao, Dr. General Hooda, you are better positioned. She's asking, will the history repeat itself with the US creating a trust deficit with India by getting closer to Pakistan? She's asking this in the question of the modernization of F-16s. And you had mentioned that this is an area of concern. I
had mentioned it, but I don't see US-Pakistan relations, going back or will be something at the cost of India-US relations. I don't think. In India-US relations today stand on, their own strength. And I think it's not either or that, you get closer to the US. Yes, just as there are tensions between us and US, there will be tensions over issues like how much support are you giving to Pakistan and why are you supplying them. But to say that, relations will go back and our relations will become weaker, I don't see that happening. As I said, the strength of India-US relations today is such that I see it only sort of going forward. I agree with Anit when he said, I think we just see it going stronger as we go ahead.
I think there's something for Dr. Rao. Nitish Bhushan, and he hasn't given his designation. Are European powers trying to gather relevance in the Indo-Pacific independent of the US in the light of the exercise Pitch Black?
Oh, well, exercise Pitch Black.
And you can also come in to the ASEAN. You would like.
Okay, all right. So very quickly, well, yes. Okay, so Pitch Black, US was also a member of the Pitch Black. That's happening. But I think what he wants to know, the sense that I get, is that whether the European powers are also coming in engaging with Indo-Pacific, independent of US, or are they just, piggybacking US policies? I think that is perhaps he wants to know. Well, yes, even if you look at the European powers, I didn't really have the time to get in there, but the approach is not exactly identical. If you look at the EU and then you look at France and UK and then Germany, right? I mean, they have different portfolios, they have different interests. Initially, France is the only, so to say, the legit Indo-Pacific power because it has territories, it has residents, about 1.5 million, and it has been it has stakes in the Indo-Pacific. UK, because again of one thing I mentioned, the 5-power defense agreement, and because it was a colonial power, etc., it also has certain territory, okay, but definitely not as much as France. And the problem is that after AUKUS, there seemed to be a kind of a fault line between the Anglophonic countries on the one hand, like US and UK and Australia, versus France. And Emmanuel Macron was publicly extremely upset, and they used to consider it a stab in the back. And in fact, all the French that we met after AUKUS until some time ago said that it is a personal insult and etc. But the good thing is that it's a thing of the past, and they are also trying to overcome the differences. And the most potent example that comes to my mind right now is that the revival of the India-France-Australia trilateral. Okay, that's one. And the other thing is that even when you look at, the thing that we need to remember is that even when we are talking about European powers, we are not talking about everybody is not the same, and they are going to be engaging. Their engagement in Indo-Pacific is going to be calibrated according to their stakes and national interests. So you can't really have one formula that fits them all. But yes, EU, why? Because when you say EU, it is like a collective voice of the 27 other countries as well. So short answer there. As far as The other thing that you asked about, I'm forgetting. Oh yeah, that I wanted to come in briefly to respond to Dr. Amit. Well, I totally agree with you, Dr. Amit, that what really is ASEAN centrality when China has been dividing ASEAN for years, right? And therein I said that when you look at ASEAN, we understand that for making any initiative in the Indo-Pacific work, we need to make it ASEAN centric. But the problem is that you don't have ASEAN as a whole. Therefore, it makes sense to actually to engage more with countries like Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia that have jurisdiction over the major SLOCs. And I didn't really have time to get into how the powers that I'd chosen, whether it's France or UK or the US or India, I mean, how many overlapping arrangements, trilaterals, etc. they have, particularly with these 2 or 3 countries that I meant. So I totally agree that you cannot be dealing with ASEAN as a whole. So I hope I responded to some of those questions. Oh yeah, I think it was about pitch black. I'm sorry, if you give me another few seconds, I'll just say. So pitch black was a collective exercise. I think why it was in news was because India was participating in the pitch black. Germany was participating for the first time. France definitely is a participant. UK is a participant. But it actually became, a little talked about in India because then after a few days, the Vostok exercises started happening in Russia, where India only engaged with India did not engage with the maritime component because we did not really want to get into those waters with Japan, because Japan and Russia have problems over Kuril, etc. So I think it was because of that that came to light, where India's wholehearted participation in the pitch black versus India's half-hearted participation in the Vostok, and that was being played out again and again as to, does that really show India's coming of age or shifting of stand with respect to how we want to stand with the Western allies versus the Russians, etc. I think there was part truth in it, but not really the way it was put up. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it'd be good to hear, Mr. Vickery's views on that U.S.-Pakistan relations and that question.
Well, I think there's no question that the United States has thrown the weight of its engagement with India. When you have the President of the United States saying that India is the indispensable partner, and then not saying something equivalent, it's pretty plain that there has been a complete decoupling of the old hyphenated, whatever you do with India, you have to do with Pakistan. That's no longer the case. And I would say that goes not only to interests vis-a-vis China, but the fact that there has been such warm and growing relationships across the board between India and the United States. Pakistan is troublesome from many areas, but you can look at one area of terrorism and see that the relationship with India is waxing, while that with Pakistan is waning. That's not to say that there isn't a need both for India and the U.S. to deal positively with Pakistan and not look at it just as a uniform actor. There are forces within Pakistan. In fact, some would say that there's really some question as to how united the country is. But bottom line is that the relationship with India is indispensable, and that is the guide star of what's going to happen in the future.
I think we have really come to the end, towards the end, and I would proceed for a vote of thanks by Mr. Bipul Chatterjee, who is the Executive Director of Cuts International.
Thank you, Dipanjan. Let me also thank all our panelists for this fascinating discussion. So my intention is not to summarize this discussion. Of course, we are going to come out with a brief report, just summarizing the main points, which will be circulated other than the video of this webinar. I would like to highlight just a couple of points. points. One is that you remember, all of us, I think, could remember that sometime last year, when Secretary Blinken was here, he made a comment that the future of Indo-U.S. Indo-American relationship is going to be a consequential relationship. So that's something which we have to keep in mind. I mean, it's going to be a consequences of several developments which are taking place, which are going to take place in future. The second point is what our foreign minister said a few weeks back, that where he has challenged this notion of Asia for the Asians, which effectively means that there is and there will be role of other powers in this in Asia, which he meant effectively was the role of Australia and United States in Asia. So we have to keep all these things in mind, and the essential point is that we have to keep our ultimate interest in mind, which is our national security, both in military sense as well as in non-military or non-traditional aspects of security. So keeping that in mind, I think there is no other way of working together than these two great democracies of the world. I think at the end of the day, and of course, there is no particular definition of long run, but I'm taking 2050 as a long-term horizon, 20, 25 years, 30 years from now. We have to see that not just democracies can deliver, but also democracies should deliver. So we have to keep this big picture in mind and then see that how we can adapt to various challenges which are going to come up in our relationship, in our partnership. So with that, these are a couple of things which I wanted to flag. Let me also speak very, very briefly about what we intend to do in this initiative going forward. We're going to have a series of physical workshops in various cities of India, where our intention is to reach out to local language media, those people, to generate their interest on topics like this. Unfortunately, there is not much. So that is one of our objectives. Secondly, we're going to come out with further research on emerging important issues like transfer of technology, India's defense offset policy, and things like that. And also, as part of this research, we are also going to come out with a compendium of articles, thoughts, news items of different important developments in respect to Indo-U.S. Defense Partnership, defense relationship, in the larger context of security, our national security in the Indo-Pacific region, and things like that. And we're going to end this initiative with a big conclave, which we're going to organize in New Delhi sometime in next year, sometime in the second or third quarter of next year, where I think that will help us not just to discuss many of these topics, but also to come out with a forward-looking agenda for India and US to work together. The two large and great democracies to work together. And I think that will also help. I mean, we're not looking at Indo-US relationship in silos, but also there are other powers, middle powers and other powers who are democracies, how we can work together in order to address security and non-security related challenges which are there and which are emerging. And I think that as we are entering into a recession worldwide, so those challenges are going to be much more. And this time the recession may not be shallow and short, but it's likely that it's going to be deep and long. So with that, there'll be also challenges like food security coming from climate change and various other factors. So all these things taken together, I see that the scope for relationship building partnership between India and US is huge. And we have been working on, by we, I mean the Indian establishment and various other players. We have been working together on many of these subjects. So of course, there'll be hiccups, there'll be challenges, but we know how to deal with them. So with that, let me once again thank Dipanjan for his excellent moderation. And I must say that it's he who aroused my interest in international relations. I must acknowledge that. And it was he who told me that you can't really understand international relations unless you have a deep interest in both history and geography. So you have to keep those things in mind. And of course, of 4 of our speakers, we have learned a lot from them. Let us see what is our capacity to absorb all these thoughts. So thank you very much. And I hope that, I'm not just hope, I'm sure that we'll be in touch with each of one of you as we move forward in this initiative. Thank you, good evening and good night. In case of Ray, it's still morning. So thank you.